If you've ever looked up the digital nomad budget, you've probably seen the same number over and over, around $1,500 a month. And if you've ever tried to live this way, you might have had the same reaction I did. How is anybody doing that consistently? I've tracked every dollar I've spent for the last 7 years, and when I went back through my data, my cheapest full year still averaged $3,293 per month. This video is my version. What I actually spend, what drives that number up or down, and what the $1,500 per month version leaves out. The $1,500 a month number usually comes from a very specific setup. One person, one cheap city, one small apartment, and very little movement. Usually somewhere like Chiang Mai, Thailand, or Bali. And if you stay in one low-cost place, cook most of your meals, and keep life very steady, that number can work. But before I get into my numbers, I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to do this lifestyle as cheaply as possible. I prioritize enjoyment and value. If there's a restaurant worth trying, I'll do the tasting menu. If there's a destination that's difficult and expensive to reach, but interesting, I still want to go. If a nicer apartment will make my workday noticeably better, I'll choose that. So the numbers you're about to see are not a blueprint for minimizing costs. They're what this lifestyle looks like when you're trying to enjoy it fully, yet responsibly, rather than trying to find the absolute floor. For the last 7 years, I've tracked all of my expenses in travel spend. Apartments, groceries, restaurants, co-working spaces, and taxis. And the first thing that jumped out at me when I looked at my yearly totals was how consistent the numbers are. In 2019, I spent $47,477, which works out to $3,956 per month. In 2020, it was $49,394, or $4,116 a month. In 2021, it dropped to $41,726, or about $3,477 a month. In 2022, it was $41,935, or $3,495 a month. In 2023, it came to $43,185, around $3,599 a month. In 2024, my cheapest year, it dropped to $39,517, which is where the $3,293 monthly average comes from. And 2025 ended at $41,986, roughly $3,499 a month. So across very different countries, very different years, and a significant shift in whether I was traveling solo or with a partner, my total annual spending stayed surprisingly tight. Of course, 2020 was an unusual year, but in 2020, 2021, and most of 2022, I was also traveling almost entirely solo. From late 2022 onwards, I've been traveling primarily with my partner, Kevin, and splitting costs accordingly. That's a significant shift in how the costs were structured, but the annual totals still stayed in the same range. That's the first big thing this data shows. Second is where the cheapest months actually happened. Because if you ask the internet, it would probably tell you they'd all be in Southeast Asia. One thing to flag before I get into this is I'm looking at calendar months. So some of my least expensive destinations don't show up cleanly here. Bulgaria, for example, is consistently one of my cheapest places to be. But several of my Bulgaria stretches start mid-month and end mid-month, so they don't show up neatly in this analysis. My cheapest calendar month in this whole dataset was February 2024 in Lagos, Nigeria. I spent $1,463. The next month, traveling through Benin, Togo, and Ghana cost $1,780. In February 2025, I spent $1,835 in Buenos Aires. In June 2023, a month in Bansko, Bulgaria came in at $1,935. And my Bansko stay in 2024 cost even less, but it didn't show up in this analysis because it crossed calendar months. So the two cheapest months in 7 years weren't in Southeast Asia. They weren't in Bali or Chiang Mai or any other another destination that typically shows up on a cheap Nomad destinations list. They were in West Africa. And I'll be honest, it's not easy to be a digital nomad in West Africa. The infrastructure is less reliable, the visa logistics are more complex, and it's not somewhere where most people are just going to decide to spend a month. So I'm not necessarily presenting this as a recommendation here, just as data. But all of this tells me that inexpensive months aren't just about picking the right destination from the usual list. After looking at the data, 3 things explained most of the variance: destination mix, how fast I was moving, and what mode I was actually living in. Movement pace is the big one. When I have longer stays, spending usually drops. When I move more frequently, costs rise quickly. Simple example is from 2025. I spent $2,355 in Bansko, one place for essentially the whole month. In September of 2025, I was moving around Italy with stays of 4 or 5 nights at a time, and my longest stretch being just 1 week. That month came in at $3,150. Same year, different pace, almost $800 more for that month. The outlier trips are their own category. In November 2025, I spent $8,213 during a Somalia and Somaliland expedition. In December 2025, I spent $6,870 in Djibouti. Those are not normal lifestyle months. They're special trips with unusual logistics. And when you remove those big outliers, my more typical lifestyle range is $2,500 to $3,500 a month. I've been doing this full time for over 12 years across 129 countries, and I cover money and travel professionally for Forbes Advisor. So I care a lot about the difference between a catchy number and a useful one. Tracked data is the only way to actually see these patterns. Another thing the data makes obvious is that you're not just budgeting for a place. You're budgeting for how you actually live in that place. A good example is Bansko during Nomad Fest versus a typical month there. Same city, same cost of living, but the social context completely changes how you spend. More events, more dinners out, more saying yes to things, more expensive. Before I get into what these numbers represent in practice, a few things about how they're calculated. These figures are my personal share only. Accommodation and some other expenses are split with Kevin. Health insurance doesn't appear because it's covered through my employer. Business expenses like software and tools also aren't included. But everything else, flights, special trips, all of it, it's in here. So what does $2,500 to $3,500 a month actually go toward? For me, sometimes it means choosing the better apartment because it makes working easier. Going to the restaurant everyone says is worth it instead of skipping it to save money. Or booking the better flight itinerary even when a cheaper option exists. These decisions add up, but they're deliberate. People watching this probably aren't benchmarking against a blog number. They're asking whether my lifestyle costs more or less than theirs. In cities like New York or San Francisco, rent alone can easily run $3,000 to $4,000 a month. Add in food, transportation, and everything else, and a normal life can easily look like $6,000 to $8,000 a month. I'm spending significantly less than that on average, and the quality of life I get abroad is better than what I would get at home for that same cost. If someone asks me what number to plan around, the honest answer is it depends on where and how you want to live. But based on my data, $3,000 a month is a realistic baseline if you want a comfortable, sustainable version of this lifestyle. Not the floor and not luxury. Potentially add in a separate budget for bigger trips and think about the whole year, not just 1 month. This lifestyle isn't defined by a single month. It's defined by the pattern across the year. I've linked my Nomad financial resources in the description. It covers the tools I actually use for tracking my spending, plus some financial setup questions worth thinking through. And if you want more videos built on real numbers and honest trade-offs, hit subscribe. See you next week.